The Hexham Heads by David Eden. Chapter 1. The Unearthing. The spade bit deep into the dark Northumberland earth with a sound like breaking bones. Colin Robson paused, wiping sweat from his brow despite the February chill that hung over Hexham like a shroud. The garden behind his terraced house on Red Avenue had been nothing but weeds and brambles when he'd moved in 3 months ago, but Margaret insisted they needed vegetables come spring. "Just a bit more, love," she called from the kitchen window, her voice carrying the particular note of wifely encouragement that meant get on with it. Colin grimaced and drove the spade down again. This time, it struck something that definitely wasn't soil. The metallic ring echoed across the narrow garden, causing next door's dog to whimper and slink away. Colin knelt and scraped away the black earth with his hands, his fingernails collecting grime that seemed older than the house itself. What emerged made his breath catch in his throat. It was a head, not human, at least he desperately hoped not, but carved from some kind of gray-green stone that seemed to drink in the weak winter light. The face was crude, primitive, with deep-set hollows for eyes and a mouth that appeared to be screaming, or perhaps laughing. In the growing dusk, it was impossible to tell which would be worse. "Margaret," he called, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Come have a look at this." She appeared at the back door, drying her hands on her apron, 11-year-old Michael and 9-year-old David trailing behind her like curious puppies. The family clustered around the hole Colin had dug, their faces pale in the dying light. "Christ," Margaret whispered, then clapped a hand over her mouth. She tried not to swear in front of the boys, but sometimes the words just escaped. "What is it?" "Stone head," Colin said, as if that explained anything. He worked his fingers around the object, trying to lift it free. The stone was heavier than it looked, and strangely warm despite having been buried in the cold earth. "There's another one here, I think." The second head was slightly smaller, carved in the same primitive style, but with what might have been a Celtic knot pattern around its base. This one's expression was different, sadder, perhaps, or simply ancient beyond measure. Colin set both heads on the garden path, where they seemed to watch the family with their hollow eyes. "They're old," Michael said with the matter-of-fact tone of a boy who'd been reading about archaeology in his school library. "Really old. Like hundreds of years, maybe." "Don't touch them," Margaret said sharply, though neither boy had moved toward the heads. Something about them seemed to warn against casual contact. "Colin, where do you suppose they came from?" Colin shrugged, but his eyes never left the stone faces. "Buried treasure, I suppose, though I can't imagine what anyone would want with them." That was the moment, though none of them realized it then, when their lives changed forever. The moment when the Hexham Heads, as they would come to be known, returned to the world of the living after God only knew how long in the dark earth. As if summoned by their emergence, a wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the old oak tree that dominated the garden's far corner. The tree had been there when they'd moved in, its roots probably extending well beyond the property line. For a moment, Colin could have sworn he heard something in that wind, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from very far away, or perhaps very close. "Let's get them inside," Margaret said, though she made no move to pick up the heads herself, at least until we can figure out what to do with them. But Colin was already reaching for them, drawn by something he couldn't name. The stone was definitely warm now, almost alive beneath his fingers. As he lifted the larger head, he felt a strange tingling in his palms, as if a weak electric current was running through the ancient stone. Behind them, the oak tree's branches scratched against the darkening sky like skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl. The Hexham Heads had awakened, and with them, something else. Chapter 2. First Signs. The heads sat on the kitchen table like unwelcome dinner guests, their hollow eyes reflecting the fluorescent light in ways that made Margaret's skin crawl. She'd covered them with a tea towel after supper, but somehow that made things worse. The lumpy shapes beneath the checked fabric looked like small corpses awaiting autopsy. "I don't like them in here," she said to Colin as he washed the dishes. Outside, the February wind howled around the corners of the house, rattling the windows in their frames. "They give me the willies." Colin dried his hands and pulled the tea towel away, revealing the stone faces once more. In the kitchen's harsh light, they looked even more ancient and malevolent than they had in the garden. The larger head's mouth seemed to have widened into a more pronounced grin, though that was surely just a trick of the shadows. "They're just old carvings," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably Celtic or Roman, could be worth something to the right collector." Margaret shuddered. "I don't want money from those things. There's something wrong with them, Colin. Something." She searched for the word. "Unclean." Upstairs, a door slammed. Both adults froze. The sound had come from the boy's bedroom, sharp and sudden in the quiet house. Colin frowned and called up the stairs. "Michael, David, no slamming doors." Silence. "Boys?" More silence, thick and oppressive. Colin and Margaret exchanged glances. Margaret's face had gone pale, and Colin felt his own pulse quicken. They'd put the boys to bed an hour ago, and both had been tired from the excitement of the day's discovery. Colin started toward the stairs, but Margaret caught his arm. "Listen," she whispered. From above came a new sound, a rhythmic thumping, as if someone was bouncing a ball against the ceiling. Thump, thump, thump. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. "Stay here," Colin said, though his voice cracked on the words. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The landing was dark, lit only by the thin strip of light escaping from under the boy's door. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing but the sound of steady breathing. When he pushed the door open, both boys were fast asleep. Michael lay on his back, mouth slightly open, while David was curled into a tight ball under his blankets. Neither showed any sign of having been awake recently. Colin stood in the doorway for a long moment, listening. The house was quiet now, save for the wind outside and the distant hum of the refrigerator. He was about to close the door when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. David's football, which had been sitting on the shelf when they'd said goodnight, was now on the floor beside Michael's bed. As Colin watched, it rolled slightly, as if pushed by an invisible hand, then came to rest against the baseboard. He backed out of the room and closed the door with exaggerated care. When he reached the kitchen, Margaret was standing by the sink, her arms wrapped around herself. "Well?" she asked. "They're asleep," Colin said, but he couldn't bring himself to mention the football. "Must have been the wind. Old house, you know, settling." Margaret nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to the heads on the table. "I want them out of here, Colin. Tonight." "Don't be daft. It's nearly 10 o'clock. Where would we put them?" "I don't care. The shed, the garage, anywhere but in the house." Before Colin could respond, the kitchen light flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. In the brief moments of darkness, the heads seemed to move, their expressions shifting in ways that defied explanation. "Right," Colin said, his voice hoarse. "The shed it is." He wrapped the heads in an old newspaper, trying not to look at their faces as he did so. The stone was still warm, almost feverish now, and he could swear he felt a pulse beneath his fingers, slow and rhythmic like a sleeping heart. The back garden was a maze of shadows, the oak tree's branches creating a canopy of darkness overhead. Colin's torch beam wavered as he made his way to the small shed at the garden's rear. The wind had died down, but somehow the silence was worse than the howling had been. The shed smelled of damp earth and rust. Colin placed the wrapped heads on the workbench, between a dusty paint tin and a collection of garden tools. Even through the newspaper, he could feel their presence, a weight that seemed to press against his consciousness like a physical thing. As he turned to leave, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. He spun around, torch beam dancing wildly, but the shed was empty, save for the wrapped heads and the accumulation of years. The growl came again, and this time, Colin realized it was coming from outside, from the direction of the old oak tree. He stumbled out of the shed, his heart hammering against his ribs. The garden was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Colin ran for the house, not caring how foolish he looked. Behind him, something moved in the darkness, something large and shambling, with eyes that glowed like amber coals. But when he reached the kitchen and looked back through the window, the garden was empty once more. "Did you put them away?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Colin nodded, not trusting himself to speak. But as he locked the back door and drew the curtains, he knew with absolute certainty that putting the heads in the shed had solved nothing. If anything, it had made things worse. Chapter 3, The Watcher's Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace to the Robson household. Margaret tossed and turned beside Colin, muttering words in a language he didn't recognize, guttural sounds that seemed to scrape against the darkness like fingernails on slate. When he tried to awake her, she stared at him with eyes that held no recognition, speaking in that strange tongue until he shook her shoulders hard enough to rattle her teeth. "What?" she gasped, suddenly herself again. "What is it?" "You were talking in your sleep," Colin said, though talking seemed inadequate for the sounds that had poured from her mouth. "Some kind of, I don't know, foreign language." Margaret sat up, her nightgown damp with perspiration despite the February chill. "I was dreaming," she said slowly, "about the heads. They were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand. The words felt old, older than English, older than anything." From the boys' room came a soft thudding sound, rhythmic and insistent. Not the football this time, something heavier, more deliberate. Colin checked the bedside clock, 2:47 a.m. The witching hour, his grandmother would have called it, though he'd never given much credence to such nonsense, until now. The thudding stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made both adults freeze, the unmistakable creak of the back door opening. Colin was certain he'd locked it, had checked it twice before coming to bed, but the sound was distinctive, the particular groan of hinges that needed oiling. "Stay here," Colin whispered, reaching for the cricket bat he kept beside the bed. Margaret clutched his arm. "Don't leave me alone," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please." They crept downstairs together, Margaret's hand gripping Colin's free arm so tightly he could feel her fingernails through his pajama sleeve. The kitchen was bathed in moonlight, the back door standing wide open. Cold air swept through the house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something animal and wild. "The shed," Margaret whispered. "Look at the shed." The small structure stood open, its door hanging askew. Even from the kitchen window, they could see that the workbench was empty. The heads were gone. Colin's blood turned to ice water. "Call the police," he said, "and tell them what? That our haunted stone heads walked away?" Before Colin could answer, they heard it, a sound that would haunt their dreams for years to come. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but grew into something that was part growl, part howl, part human scream. The sound came from the garden, from the direction of the old oak tree. Margaret's grip on his arm tightened. "Oh God, Colin! Oh God, what is that?" The sound came again, closer now. Through the open door, they could see a shape moving in the shadows beneath the oak. It was large, larger than any dog, moving with a peculiar shambling gait. As it stepped into a patch of moonlight, Colin's mind refused to process what he was seeing. The thing was covered in coarse, dark fur, but it walked upright like a man. Its head was massive, elongated, with eyes that glowed amber in the darkness. When it turned toward the house, Colin saw its face, or what might have been a face. The features were a horrifying blend of human and animal, with a mouth full of teeth that gleamed like ivory daggers. "Close the door," Margaret whispered. "Close it now." But Colin found himself frozen, transfixed by the creature's gaze. Those amber eyes held an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. The thing tilted its head, studying them with the casual interest of a predator sizing up prey. Then it smiled. The expression was so incongruous, so wrong on that bestial face, that Colin's paralysis broke. He lunged forward and slammed the door shut, his fingers fumbling with the lock. Behind him, Margaret was already on the phone, her voice shaking as she spoke to the emergency operator. "There's someone in our garden," she said. "Something in our garden. Please, you have to send someone." Colin pressed his back against the door, as if his weight could keep the thing outside. Through the wood, he could hear it moving, circling the house with deliberate, measured steps. Occasionally, it would pause, and Colin could swear he heard it sniffing at the doorframe, the sound of deep, purposeful breathing. "They're sending a car," Margaret said, hanging up the phone. 10 minutes. 10 minutes felt like an eternity. They huddled together in the kitchen, listening to the creature's movements outside. It seemed to be testing the house, trying windows, scratching at the walls. Once they heard it on the roof, its claws clicking against the slate tiles. The boys slept through it all, which was perhaps the most unnerving thing of all. No child should sleep so deeply with such sounds echoing through the house. When Colin checked on them, he found both boys lying in exactly the same positions as before, their breathing deep and regular. On the windowsill sat the two stone heads, their hollow eyes staring out into the night. Colin's scream died in his throat. He hadn't moved them. The heads had been in the shed, and now they were here, in his son's bedroom, watching over them like malevolent guardians. He snatched up the heads, their warmth burning his palms, and carried them back to the kitchen. Margaret's eyes went wide when she saw them. How did they? I don't know. Colin said, setting them on the table. But they're staying where I can see them. The police arrived exactly 10 minutes later. PC David Williamson, a young constable who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He searched the garden thoroughly with his torch, checking the shed, examining the churned earth around the oak tree. But he found nothing. Probably just a large dog, he told them, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe got loose from one of the farms. The muddy prints are hard to make out, but they look canine. Colin wanted to argue, to insist that what they'd seen was no dog, but how could he explain? How could he tell this earnest young policeman that they'd witnessed something that had no place in the rational world? After PC Williamson left, promising to file a report and increase patrols in the area, Colin and Margaret sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stone heads. Dawn was breaking outside, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. "We have to get rid of them," Margaret said. "Whatever's happening, it's because of those things." Colin nodded, though part of him wondered if it was already too late. The heads had been buried for who knew how long, and now they were awake. The question was, what else had awakened with them? Outside, the oak tree's branches swayed in the morning breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled in response to some primal call that only it could hear. Chapter 4. The expert, Dr. Ann Ross, arrived at the Robson house on a gray Thursday morning, her Morris Minor puttering down Reed Avenue like a tired beetle. She was a small woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. When she looked at the stone heads sitting on the kitchen table, her face went pale. "Dear God," she whispered, setting down her leather satchel with trembling hands. "Where did you say you found these?" Colin gestured toward the back garden. "Buried about 3 feet down, near the old oak. My wife wanted me to plant vegetables, and—" "How long have you had them?" Dr. Ross interrupted, her voice sharp with urgency. 5 days, Margaret said. 5 days of hell. Dr. Ross nodded grimly. She was a lecturer in Celtic studies at Newcastle University, and when Colin had finally worked up the courage to call someone about their archaeological find, she'd been the only expert willing to make the drive to Hexham. Now he was beginning to understand why. "These aren't just any Celtic artifacts," she said, circling the table like a predator studying prey. "They're fertility symbols, yes, but something more, something much older and more dangerous." She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the crude carvings more closely. The stonework is primitive, probably pre-Roman, but the symbols, she traced the air above the smaller head's base. This isn't Celtic at all. It's much older, Neolithic possibly. "What does that mean?" Colin asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "It means these heads are at least 4,000 years old, and if I'm right about what they are, you're in considerable danger." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "Tell us something we don't know. We've had things moving on their own, strange sounds, and last night," she shuddered. "Last night there was something in the garden, something that wasn't human." Dr. Ross's face went even paler. "Describe it." Colin found himself recounting the events of the previous night, watching as Dr. Ross's expression grew increasingly grave. When he finished, she sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "I was afraid of this," she said. "These aren't just fertility symbols. They're prison stones." "Prison stones?" Margaret asked. "Ancient peoples sometimes used carved stones to bind malevolent spirits to keep them from entering our world. The heads act as both lock and key. They contain the entity, but they also provide a way for it to influence the physical realm if disturbed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock. Outside, clouds were gathering, turning the morning dark despite the early hour. "What kind of entity?" Colin asked, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Ross was quiet for a long moment, staring at the heads with a mixture of fascination and terror. The Celts had many names for it: shapeshifter, skinwalker, but the most common term was creature, something that existed between the world of men and the world of beasts. "Like a werewolf?" Margaret asked. "Similar, but older, more primal. The werewolf legends are just echoes of something much more ancient and terrible." Dr. Ross reached into her satchel and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I've been researching these things for 20 years, following reports of similar artifacts across Britain. Wherever they appear, the same pattern emerges: mysterious animal attacks, disappearances, sightings of creatures that shouldn't exist." She opened the journal and showed them a series of photographs and newspaper clippings. Headlines screamed about savage dog attacks, missing hikers, and bizarre animal sightings. The photos showed stones similar to the Hexham Heads, always found in areas where the strange events occurred. "What happened to the people who found them?" Colin asked. Dr. Ross's silence was answer enough. "We have to get rid of them," Margaret said. "Today, right now." "It's not that simple, Dr. Ross replied. "The entity is already aware of you. It's already begun to manifest. Simply moving the heads won't break the connection." "Then what do we do?" Colin asked. Before Dr. Ross could answer, the lights flickered. The temperature in the kitchen dropped noticeably, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The heads on the table began to emit a low humming sound, like tuning forks struck in harmony. "It's here," Dr. Ross whispered. "It's trying to manifest during daylight. That's never happened before." The humming grew louder, and the heads began to glow with a sickly green light. The carved features seemed to move, expressions shifting from mirth to rage to something that might have been hunger. Upstairs, the boys began to scream. Colin bolted for the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. Behind him, he could hear Margaret and Dr. Ross following, their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The screaming continued, high and terrified, coming from both boys at once. He burst into their bedroom to find Michael and David sitting up in their beds, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the window. Colin followed their gaze and felt his heart stop. The creature was there, pressed against the glass, its amber eyes boring into the room. But this time, Colin could see it clearly in the gray morning light. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in coarse dark fur that seemed to absorb light. Its face was a nightmare fusion of human and wolf, with intelligence gleaming in those terrible eyes. When it saw Colin, it smiled, revealing rows of yellowed fangs. Then it raised one clawed hand and tapped gently on the window. The glass spider-webbed under the impact, but held. "Mummy," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "It wants to come in." Dr. Ross pushed past Colin, her face set in grim determination. "Everyone out of the room. Now." "But the boys," Margaret started. "The boys will be fine once we get those heads out of the house. The creature can't fully manifest while they're inside, but it's getting stronger. We need to act now before it breaks through." As if summoned by her words, the creature struck the window again. This time, the glass shattered inward, showering the room with glittering shards. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something that smelled like centuries of decay. The creature began to climb through the window, its massive form struggling with the relatively small opening. But it was determined, and Colin could see that it would succeed. "The heads!" Dr. Ross shouted over the sound of splintering wood as the creature forced its way through. "We need to get them out of the house. It's the only way to weaken it enough to drive it back." But as they turned to run, Colin realized with growing horror that they might already be too late. The creature was inside now, its heavy breathing filling the room like the sound of a steam engine. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear more of them, pack calls echoing across the moors, answering the summoning cry of their brother. The Hexham Heads had not imprisoned just one entity. They had imprisoned them all. Chapter 5. The Pack. The creature's breathing filled the bedroom like the sound of a broken bellows, each inhalation bringing with it the stench of charnel houses and forgotten graves. Colin grabbed Michael under one arm and David under the other, backing toward the door as the thing finished squeezing through the shattered window. Glass crunched under its massive paws as it stood to its full height, nearly brushing the ceiling. "Don't run," Dr. Ross whispered urgently. "Sudden movements will trigger its hunting instincts." But the boys were beyond listening. David broke free from his father's grip and bolted for the door, his bare feet slapping against the floorboards. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, amber eyes blazing with predatory interest. It moved with horrible speed, crossing the room in 2 bounds. Colin threw himself between the beast and his son, feeling claws rake across his shoulder as he tackled David to the ground. The creature's roar shook the windows in their frames, a sound that belonged in primordial forests, not suburban bedrooms. "The heads!" Dr. Ross shouted. "Get the heads!" Margaret was already moving, racing down the stairs with Michael in tow. Colin scooped up David and followed, the creature's snarls echoing behind them. In the kitchen, the stone heads were glowing brighter now, their crude features animated with malevolent life. "They're the anchor," Dr. Ross said, pulling strange implements from her satchel, vials of what looked like salt, a bundle of dried herbs, and something that might have been a bone knife. "As long as they're in the house, the creature can maintain its physical form." The ceiling above them groaned under the weight of the beast as it paced back and forth, searching for a way down. The stairs were too narrow for its bulk, but Colin could hear it testing the floorboards, looking for weak spots. "How do we get them out?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with panic. "That thing is between us and the doors." Dr. Ross was already moving, sprinkling salt in a circle around the kitchen table. "Ancient binding ritual," she said. "It won't hold for long, but it might give us a chance." She began to chant in a language that predated English, her voice rising and falling in cadences that seemed to resonate in the very walls. The head's glow flickered, and for a moment, the creature's pacing stopped. Then the back door exploded inward. A second creature stood in the doorway, this one even larger than the first. Its eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the terrified family and the glowing heads. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding stone. "Give us what is ours." Colin's mind reeled. The thing could speak. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed intelligence as well as savagery. "Never," Dr. Ross said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They stay bound." The creature's laugh was like breaking glass. "Bound? You understand nothing, woman. We were never bound. We were sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake. The heads are not our prison. They are our eggs." The temperature in the kitchen plummeted. Ice began to form on the windows, and their breath came out in white puffs. The heads on the table pulsed with increasing brightness, and Colin could swear he saw movement within the stone, something writhing, struggling to break free. "The ritual," Dr. Ross whispered. "It's not working. They're too strong." From upstairs came a tremendous crash as the first creature found its way down. Colin could hear it moving through the house, its claws clicking on the hardwood floors. They were trapped, caught between 2 monsters with nowhere to run. "The cellar," Margaret said suddenly. "There's a cold chute that leads outside." Colin nodded. The old house had been built in the 1920s when coal deliveries were made through a small door that opened directly into the basement. It would be a tight squeeze, but the boys could fit through easily enough. "Take the boys," he said. "I'll get the heads." "Colin, no. Someone has to do it. Go." Margaret hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the boys and headed for the cellar door. Dr. Ross remained by the table, her chanting growing more desperate as the salt circle began to break apart. "The binding is failing," she said. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Colin reached for the heads, his hands shaking. The stone was burning hot now, almost too hot to touch. As his fingers closed around the larger head, images flashed through his mind. Ancient forests, blood-soaked rituals, creatures that had hunted men when the world was young. The first creature appeared in the kitchen doorway, its massive form filling the frame. It was breathing heavily, saliva dripping from its fangs. Behind it, Colin could see the second creature moving closer, blocking any chance of escape. "You cannot take them," the first creature said, its voice a low rumble. "They are awakening. Soon, they will be born into this world, and the hunt will begin again." "Like hell," Colin said, and bolted for the cellar door. The creatures moved simultaneously, their roars shaking the house to its foundations. Colin felt claws rake across his back as he dove through the doorway, tumbling down the cellar steps with the heads clutched to his chest. Behind him, Dr. Ross screamed. The cellar was dark and cold, filled with the detritus of decades, old furniture, boxes of Christmas decorations, a workbench covered in rust. Margaret and the boys were already at the coal chute, trying to force open the rusted door. "It's stuck," Margaret said, panic evident in her voice. Colin set the heads on the workbench and grabbed a crowbar from the tool rack. The metal door was old and warped, but after several attempts, it gave way with a shriek of protesting hinges. "Boys first," he said, lifting David toward the opening. The coal chute was narrow, but it led directly to the side garden. They could escape, get to the neighbors, call for help. But as David squeezed through the opening, Colin heard something that made his blood run cold. From above came the sound of Dr. Ross's chanting, but now it was different, wrong. The words were the same, but the voice was changing, becoming deeper, more guttural. "Hurry," he whispered to Margaret as she helped Michael through the chute. "Something's happening to Dr. Ross." The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that was part laughter, part howl. Then came heavy footsteps on the stairs, accompanied by a voice that was no longer entirely human. "Colin," the thing that had been Dr. Ross called, "come back up. The transformation is beginning. You should witness the birth of gods." Colin grabbed the heads and pushed Margaret toward the chute. "Go, now. I'm not leaving you. Go." She squeezed through the opening, and Colin was alone in the cellar with the heads and whatever was coming down the stairs. The stone faces were glowing so brightly now that they illuminated the entire basement. And within that light, Colin could see something moving, something that wanted desperately to be born. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and Colin saw Dr. Ross emerge from the darkness. But it wasn't Dr. Ross anymore. Her face was elongating, her teeth growing into fangs. Her eyes had taken on that familiar amber glow. "The pack grows," she said, her voice now a mixture of human and animal. "Join us, Colin. The hunt is about to begin." Colin looked at the heads in his hands, then at the transformed Dr. Ross, then at the cold chute that represented his only chance of escape. The opening was too small for him to fit through while carrying the heads, but if he left them behind... The creature that had been Dr. Ross smiled, reading his thoughts. "You begin to understand. The choice is simple. Join us, or watch your world burn." Outside, Colin could hear his family calling his name, their voices growing fainter as they ran toward the safety of the neighbors. Soon, they would be beyond the reach of the pack. But for how long? The heads pulsed in his hands, and Colin felt something ancient and terrible stirring within the stone. The birth was beginning, and he was the only one who could stop it. If he was brave enough to try. Chapter 6. The Transformation. Colin's hands burned where they gripped the stone heads, the ancient carvings searing his palms like red-hot brands. The creature that had been Dr. Ross circled him in the dim cellar, her transformation accelerating with each passing moment. Her fingernails had become claws, her spine was elongating, and when she smiled, her mouth was full of needle-sharp teeth. "You feel it, don't you?" she said, her voice now a disturbing harmony of human speech and animal growl. The power flowing through the stone. "It wants to change you, Colin. It wants to make you perfect." Colin backed against the coal chute, the heads clutched to his chest. Through the opening, he could hear Margaret calling his name from the garden, her voice growing more desperate. The neighbor's house was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been on the moon. "My family," he began. "We'll be safe." Dr. Ross interrupted. "The pack protects its own. Your sons have the scent now, Colin. In time, they'll hear the call. They'll come to us willingly." The heads pulsed again, and Colin felt something crack inside the larger stone. Not the surface, something deeper, as if the very heart of the ancient carving was splitting open. Through the fissures, a sickly green light began to seep. "The birth begins," Dr. Ross whispered, her eyes reflecting the eerie glow. 4,000 years of slumber, and now they wake. You should be honored, Colin. You're witnessing the return of the old gods." Colin looked at the cold chute, measuring the distance. If he moved fast enough, if he could squeeze through before Dr. Ross reached him. But the heads were too large, too unwieldy. He'd never make it, unless he left them behind. The thought was seductive, whispering at the edges of his mind like a serpent. Drop the heads and run. Save himself. Let someone else deal with the consequences. After all, what could one man do against forces that had existed since the dawn of time? But then he thought of Michael and David, sleeping peacefully while monsters prowled their garden. He thought of Margaret, trusting him to keep their family safe. He thought of all the innocent people in Hexham who had no idea what was stirring in the darkness. "No," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I won't let you hurt them." Dr. Ross laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "Hurt them? Oh, Colin, you still don't understand. We're not going to hurt anyone. We're going to make them better, stronger. We're going to give them the gift of the hunt." The larger head cracked audibly, a sound like a gunshot in the confined space. Through the widening fissures, Colin could see something moving, something wet and alive that pulsed with its own hideous rhythm. Whatever was inside the stone was almost ready to emerge. From upstairs came the sound of the other creatures moving through the house, their heavy footsteps shaking dust from the cellar ceiling. How many were there now? How far had the infection spread? "The neighbors will have called the police," Colin said, grasping for hope. "They'll be here soon." "Will they?" Dr. Ross tilted her head, listening. "I hear no sirens, Colin, no voices. The pack has been busy while we've been talking." The implication hit Colin like a physical blow. The Hendersons next door, the elderly Jamiesons across the street, the young couple with the new baby 3 houses down, all of them within reach of the creatures, all of them helpless against something that moved faster than thought and struck without warning. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Listen, Colin. Listen to the silence." And Colin did listen, straining his ears for any sound of human activity outside. But there was nothing. No car engines, no voices, no signs of life. Even the ever-present background noise of the city seemed muted, as if the very air had grown thick and oppressive. The larger head split completely in half with a wet, tearing sound. Something that might once have been called light spilled out, but this illumination was wrong. It didn't push back the darkness so much as make it visible, revealing shadows that moved independently of their sources. And in the center of that impossible radiance, something began to take shape. It started as a writhing mass of what looked like black smoke, but as Colin watched in horrified fascination, it began to solidify. Limbs formed from the darkness, first 2, then 4, then more than he could count. A torso emerged, impossibly elongated, covered in what might have been fur or might have been moving shadow. And finally, a head took shape, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that combined the worst aspects of both. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Dr. Ross breathed, her own transformation now complete. She stood 8 feet tall, her body a grotesque fusion of woman and wolf, her amber eyes reflecting the unholy light. "This is what we could become, Colin. This is what we're meant to be." The newborn creature opened its eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its skull like malevolent stars. When it looked at Colin, he felt his sanity begin to fray at the edges. This was what had been sleeping in the stone for 4 millennia, waiting for someone foolish enough to dig it up. The second head began to crack. Colin knew he was out of time. In moments, another creature would emerge, and then another. The pack would grow, spreading across Hexham like a plague, transforming or consuming everyone in its path. Soon it would reach Newcastle, then Leeds, then London. The infection would spread until the entire world was theirs. But perhaps there was another way. Colin looked at the newborn creature, still weak from its emergence, still vulnerable. He looked at the second head, cracks spreading across its surface like a spider's web. And he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. He raised the intact head above his own, feeling the ancient power coursing through the stone. If the heads were eggs, if they contained the essence of these things, then perhaps they could be used in other ways. Perhaps they could be turned against their own children. "What are you doing?" Dr. Ross snarled, sensing the change in the air. Colin didn't answer. Instead, he began to speak words he had never learned, in a language he had never heard. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, as if the head itself was teaching him what to say. They were words of binding, of command, of a power that predated civilization. The newborn creature screamed, its voice like the sound of tearing metal. It writhed and twisted, fighting against bonds it couldn't see but could certainly feel. Dr. Ross lunged forward, but Colin's chanting held her back as well, invisible chains wrapping around her transformed body. "You don't know what you're doing," she roared. "You'll destroy everything." "Good," Colin said, his voice now carrying echoes of something ancient and terrible. "That's exactly what I intend to do." The second head cracked completely, but instead of releasing another creature, the emerging entity was pulled back into the stone by Colin's will. The newborn began to dissolve, its form breaking apart like smoke in a strong wind. But the effort was killing him. Colin could feel his life force being drained, pulled into the heads to fuel the binding spell. His vision blurred, his legs buckled, and blood began to run from his nose and ears. He was going to die. But if his death could stop this, if it could save his family and his world, then it was a price worth paying. The heads grew cold in his hands, their light fading as the creatures within were forced back into their ancient slumber. Dr. Ross's transformation began to reverse, her body shrinking back toward human proportions. But Colin knew it wasn't over. Even now, he could feel the entities fighting against his control, testing the strength of his will. The binding wouldn't last forever. Eventually, someone else would find the heads, would disturb them, would release what should never be released, unless he found a way to destroy them permanently. Through the coal chute, he could hear Margaret calling his name, her voice closer now. She was coming back for him, risking everything to save the man she loved. But if she found him like this, if she touched the heads while the binding spell was active— "Stay back," he shouted, his voice barely human now. "Don't come any closer." But even as he spoke, Colin could feel his strength failing. The spell was consuming him, burning through his life force like acid through paper. Soon, there would be nothing left to maintain the binding. And when that happened, the real nightmare would begin. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice. Colin's vision tunneled to a pinpoint of gray light as his life force poured into the ancient stones. The binding spell held, but barely, like a dam made of paper trying to contain an ocean. Through the coal chute, he could hear Margaret's footsteps approaching, her voice calling his name with increasing desperation. "Colin, the police are coming. Whatever's happening down there, we can get through this together." Police. The word almost made him laugh, if he'd had the strength left for laughter. What could P.C. Williamson and his colleagues possibly do against entities that had walked the earth when humanity was still learning to make fire? But at least it meant some of the neighbors were still alive, still human enough to make phone calls. Dr. Ross, or the thing she'd become, was frozen in place by the binding, her amber eyes burning with frustrated rage. "You're killing yourself for nothing," she snarled through clenched fangs. "Even if you destroy these vessels, there are others, buried throughout Britain, throughout the world. The old sites call to them, and eventually, someone always digs." Colin felt the truth of her words like ice in his veins. Stonehenge, Avebury, the countless stone circles and ancient monuments scattered across the landscape. How many of them concealed sleeping horrors? How many amateur archaeologists and curious gardeners had unknowingly awakened things that should have stayed buried? But that was tomorrow's nightmare. Today, he only had to worry about the heads in his hands and the creatures trying to claw their way into the world through cracks in reality. Margaret's voice was closer now, just outside the coal chute. "I can see light down there." "Colin, are you hurt?" "Stay back," he gasped, blood spattering from his lips. Don't come down here." But he could already hear her squeezing through the narrow opening, her breathing echoing in the confined space. In moments, she would be in the cellar, and if she touched him while the binding spell was active, the magical backlash would kill her instantly. The heads pulsed in his failing grip, the entities within sensing his weakness. He could feel them pressing against the barriers of his will, looking for cracks, for moments of doubt or pain they could exploit. The larger head was particularly aggressive, its consciousness alien and vast, older than human civilization. "You cannot hold us forever," it whispered directly into his mind. "Your species is young and weak. We have waited eons. We can wait a little longer." "Maybe," Colin whispered back, "but not today." He heard Margaret drop into the cellar, her sharp intake of breath as she took in the scene, Colin kneeling in a circle of his own blood, clutching two glowing stone heads while a half-transformed Dr. Ross stood frozen like a statue. The air itself seemed to thrum with barely contained power. "Dear God," Margaret breathed. "Colin, what have you done?" "What I had to do," he said, not turning around. He couldn't afford to look at her, couldn't let his concentration waver for even a second. "The boys, are they safe?" "They're with the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson called the police when she saw those things in our garden." Margaret's voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when she was fighting not to panic. "Colin, you're bleeding. We need to get you to a hospital." "No hospital can help me now," Colin said, and felt another crack appear in his mental defenses. The entities pressed against it immediately, their alien thoughts probing for weakness. "I'm the only thing standing between these creatures and the world. If I let go—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret had seen what the partially transformed Dr. Ross looked like, had heard the inhuman sounds coming from upstairs. She was smart enough to understand the implications. "There has to be another way," she said, moving closer despite his warnings. "We'll call experts, real experts. The government must have people who deal with this sort of thing." Dr. Ross laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Oh, they do. And where do you think I learned what I know? The research station in Wales, the one that doesn't appear on any official maps? We've been studying these entities for decades, preparing for their return. Some of us believed we could control them." "And the others?" Margaret asked. "Believed they should be destroyed. I thought we were wrong." Dr. Ross's eyes fixed on Colin with something that might have been respect. "Perhaps I was mistaken." Colin felt his strength ebbing like water through a cracked cup. The binding spell required constant focus, constant will, and he was only human. Already he could feel the larger entity beginning to stir again, testing the weakening bonds. "Margaret," he said urgently, "there's something you need to know about the boys." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume over the metallic scent of blood and the otherworldly reek of the partially opened stone heads. "What about them?" "Dr. Ross said they have the scent now, that eventually they'll hear the call." Colin's voice was barely a whisper. "If these things get free, if they spread, our sons might become like them." Margaret's face went pale. "No, there has to be a way to prevent that." "There is," Colin said, and made the hardest decision of his life. "But it requires a permanent sacrifice." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, Colin began to change the nature of the binding spell. Instead of simply containing the entities, he began to draw them into himself, not to release them, but to serve as a living prison. The pain was indescribable, like swallowing molten lead, but he forced himself to continue. "Colin, no!" Margaret lunged forward, but Dr. Ross broke free of her paralysis just enough to catch her arm. "Don't touch him," the transformed woman warned. "If you disrupt the spell now, they'll all break free at once." Colin felt the entities flooding into him, their alien consciousness merging with his own. For a moment, he experienced the world through their senses, tasted the terror of prey animals, felt the intoxicating rush of the hunt, understood the savage joy of transformation. He saw the world as they did, a garden ripe for harvesting, populated by weak creatures who existed only to serve the strong. But he also felt their weaknesses. They were parasites, dependent on external vessels for their existence in the physical world. Without the heads to anchor them, without human hosts to possess, they were nothing but angry thoughts screaming into the void. "The furnace," he gasped, his voice now carrying harmonics that didn't belong to any human throat. "The old coal furnace in the corner. Light it." Margaret stared at him in confusion, but Dr. Ross understood immediately. "No," she snarled. "You don't know what you're doing. The psychic backlash will destroy them," Colin finished. "Fire purifies, always has." He could feel the entities panic now, their desperate attempts to escape the trap he was becoming. "Margaret, please, trust me." She moved to the furnace, her hands shaking as she found matches in the old kindling box. The coal had been sitting there for decades, dry as bone and ready to burn. When the flames caught, they seemed to burn brighter than any natural fire, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their sources. "Bring the heads to the fire," Colin said, forcing himself to stand. Each movement was agony, as if his bones were made of broken glass. Together, we do this together. Margaret took one of the heads from his hands, gasping as the alien coldness seeped into her palms. Together they walked toward the furnace, Dr. Ross's protests echoing behind them. "You're making a mistake," the transformed woman screamed. "The energy release will level half of Hexham. You'll kill thousands." "Better thousands die than millions," Colin replied, his voice now carrying the weight of eons. "Better this ends here." At the furnace's mouth, they hesitated. Once the heads went into the flames, there would be no turning back. The entities would either be destroyed or break free in their death throes, and Colin wasn't entirely certain which would happen. But through the coal chute, he could hear sirens approaching. Police cars, fire engines, perhaps even military vehicles. Soon the authorities would arrive, and they would want to study the heads to understand them, and that way lay only madness and transformation. For the boys, Margaret whispered, understanding. For everyone, Colin agreed. Together, they cast the Hexham Heads into the flames. The explosion of psychic energy that followed would be felt by sensitive individuals as far away as Edinburgh. But in the cellar of the house on Reday Avenue, there was only light, a cleansing, purifying light that burned away 4,000 years of accumulated malevolence and left nothing but silence in its wake. When the flames died down, the heads were gone. Dr. Ross had collapsed, her transformation reversing as the entity's influence was severed. And Colin was no longer entirely human, but he was still himself. The entities were gone, destroyed in the fire that had consumed their ancient vessels. But the experience of containing them, of serving as their prison, had changed him in ways that would take years to understand. "Is it over?" Margaret asked, helping him to his feet. Colin listened to the silence, probing with senses that were no longer entirely his own. Somewhere in the distance, he could feel other stirrings, other ancient things beginning to wake in response to the psychic shockwave. The heads had been destroyed, but Dr. Ross was right. There were others, scattered across the world like seeds of nightmares. "For now," he said, wrapping his arms around his wife. "For now, it's over." But as they climbed out of the cellar and into the gray February morning, Colin knew that their real journey was just beginning. The entities were gone, but the knowledge of their existence remained, and somewhere out there, other families were digging in their gardens. Other curious souls were disturbing sights that should be left alone. The Hexham Heads were destroyed. The question was, what would emerge next? Chapter 8. After the fire, 6 months later. The garden behind the house on Red Avenue had never looked better. Margaret's vegetables had come in beautifully that summer, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, the lettuce crisp and green in neat rows. Where Colin had first dug up the heads, she'd planted roses, white ones that bloomed with unusual vigor, as if the earth itself was trying to forget what it had once contained. But Colin knew the earth remembered everything. He sat on the back step, watching Michael and David kick a football across the lawn. To any observer, they looked like perfectly normal boys, 9 and 11 now, growing fast, their voices already beginning to change. But Colin could see things that others missed. The way they moved with predatory grace when they thought no one was looking, the amber flecks that sometimes appeared in their eyes, the way dogs whimpered and crossed the street when they passed. The transformation was slow, subtle, perhaps imperceptible to anyone who hadn't shared consciousness with ancient entities. But it was there, written in their DNA, a legacy of that terrible night when the old gods had briefly touched the world. "They're still your sons," Dr. Ross had told him during one of her visits. She came by monthly now, checking on them all, monitoring the after effects of their encounter with forces beyond human understanding. Her own changes had been more dramatic, but ultimately reversible. The entities had used her as a vessel, not a permanent host. Colin's situation was different. He'd chosen to become their prison, and even after their destruction, some trace of their essence remained within him. On quiet nights, he could still hear whispers in languages that predated civilization. Sometimes he caught glimpses of the world through their alien perception, saw the thin places where reality wore thin and other things pressed against the barriers. "Dad?" David appeared beside him, football tucked under his arm. "Are you okay? You look sad." Colin forced a smile and ruffled his younger son's hair. Just thinking, son, nothing important. But David's eyes, those eyes that sometimes held depths no child should possess, studied his father with uncomfortable intensity. About the heads, the question hung in the air like smoke. They'd never spoken directly about what had happened that night, but the boys remembered. How could they not? The official story was that there had been a gas leak, hallucinations, mass hysteria. The local newspaper had run a small article about the Hexham incident, dismissing it as another case of suburban paranoia run wild. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Dr. Ross and her shadowy colleagues, P.C. Williamson, who'd been first on the scene and had seen things that would give him nightmares for the rest of his life. The few neighbors who'd witnessed the creatures before the official explanation took hold, and the Robson family, who lived with the knowledge every day. Sometimes, Colin admitted. Do you think about them? David nodded solemnly. They're still here, aren't they? Not the heads, but the feeling, like something's watching us. Michael jogged over, drawn by the serious tone of their conversation. At 11, he was starting to look more like Colin, but there was something in his stance, something in the way he held himself, that reminded his father of the creatures that had prowled their home. Mum says we might move, Michael said, settling onto the step beside them. Go somewhere new. Start fresh. Colin nodded. They'd discussed it many times, the idea of leaving Hexham behind, finding a place where the shadows didn't seem quite so deep. But he wasn't sure it would help. The change was in them now, part of them. Distance wouldn't erase what they'd experienced. Would you like that? He asked. The boys exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that siblings share, but with undertones that made Colin's skin crawl. When they were very young, all children seemed to possess a kind of telepathy. But this was different. This was something older, more purposeful. We'll go where you go, David said finally. Family stays together. The simple words carried weight that would have crushed a normal 11-year-old. But these weren't normal children anymore, if they ever had been. The entities had marked them, claimed them, and even in death, their influence lingered. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked older than her years now, lines of worry etched permanently around her eyes. But she was still beautiful, still strong, still the woman who'd stood beside him in that cellar and helped him save the world. Dinner's ready, she called. Colin, there's someone on the phone for you. Says he's from the Ministry of Defense. Colin's blood ran cold. The calls came sporadically. Government officials who'd gotten wind of what really happened in Hexham, researchers who wanted to study the family, military types who saw potential weapons in ancient powers. He'd refused them all so far, but each call made him more aware that their secrets wouldn't stay hidden forever. Tell them I'm not available, he said. Margaret hesitated. He says it's about another discovery, something in Wales. They think it might be connected to... No. Colin's voice carried more authority than he'd intended, and for a moment his family stared at him with those two knowing eyes. We're done with all that. But even as he said the words, Colin felt a familiar stirring in the back of his mind, not the entities, which were truly gone, but the knowledge they'd left behind. Somewhere in Wales, someone had found something they shouldn't have. Someone was about to make the same mistake he'd made 6 months ago. And despite everything, despite the cost and the changes and the nightmares, Colin felt the old academic curiosity awakening, the need to understand, to study, to uncover the secrets of the past. Dad? Michael was watching him with those amber-flecked eyes. You're going to help them, aren't you? Colin looked at his son, this strange, beautiful, partially transformed boy who could see into his father's heart, and realized that the choice had already been made. Not by him, but by forces set in motion long before he'd ever put spade to earth in his back garden. Yes, he said quietly. I think I am. Margaret's face crumpled with disappointment and fear, but she didn't argue. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this was their fate now. To be guardians against the dark, to stand watch over the thin places where ancient evils pressed against reality. The heads were gone, but their legacy remained. And somewhere in the Welsh countryside, another family was about to discover that the past was never really buried. As the sun set over Hexham, casting long shadows across the garden where roses bloomed over cursed ground, Colin made his decision. Tomorrow, he would call the ministry back. He would take their case, study their artifacts, and do whatever was necessary to prevent another outbreak. Because someone had to. Because the alternative was unthinkable. And because, in the end, that was what it meant to be human, to stand against the darkness, even when the darkness had already claimed part of your soul. The Hexham Heads were destroyed, but their story was far from over. In the growing twilight, Colin could hear the earth itself whispering secrets, telling tales of other buried things, other sleeping powers waiting for the right moment to wake. The hunt would never truly end. But neither would the hunters. As his family gathered around the dinner table, Colin closed his eyes and listened to the silence that wasn't really silent, to the peace that wasn't really peaceful. Somewhere out there, ancient things stirred in their graves, sensing the change in the wind. Let them come, he thought. Let them try. The Robson family was ready. End.